1999 was a fascinating year for the video game industry. Sega would release its final console, the Dreamcast, giving the world a taste of what the upcoming 6th gen had in store. And on the PC front, new game engines supporting impressive new rendering techniques were popping up left and right. It was a time of ambition, innovation, and frankly, just some goofy-ass ideas in game design that would never fly in the current market. Y2K was yet to come, and game studios were just going wild, throwing everything in the kitchen sink at the wall, regardless of if these new ideas would land or not. And one title that I think captures the energy of 1999 perfectly is the somewhat forgotten, but still reasonably unique third-person mecha shooter, Slave Zero. Slave Zero isn't some amazing magnum opus of either the shooter or mecha genre. In fact, in many ways, the game is more busted than one of Eric Andre's desks, and it's dripping in a layer of late 90s ooze that almost feels embarrassing at times. But it's a fascinating, ambitious title that to me serves as a great spokesperson for a long-dead era of video games and experimental tech, even if it's a bit of an anomaly. And with a surprise prequel and major genre shift titled Slave Zero X currently in development, I thought it's as good a time as any to take a look at what I consider to be one of the most interesting games of 1999. Slave Zero is set in a dystopian future, controlled by an evil corporate dictator known as the Sovkhan, who rules over the setting of Megacity S1 through 9 with his army of biomechanical mecha called slaves. Machines powered by genetically engineered embryos, grown using an element called dark matter, integrated into the physical body of a mechanical exoskeleton to create a fearsome giant machine of death. Sovkhan used his slave army to, in the words of the game's own opening text crawl, strengthen his control over the Asian conglomerates. And that's how you know right away that this game is a true late 90s sci-fi story. Vague, unspecific East Asian iconography. You take the role of a rebel or guardian soldier named Chan, who sacrificed their human form to integrate their soul into a stolen slave unit, the all-powerful Slave Zero. It's up to Chan and their new Slave Zero body to finally destroy the Sovkhan and his forces, and shift the state of the battle to the Guardian's favor. The game sends you on a rampage across the megacity, as you blast through Sovkhan's forces through every district. And that's pretty much all that happens in Slave Zero's story. It's very bare bones, even for a shooter of its time, and there's a few reasons why this is the case. This all ties into Slave Zero's development history, which I think should be covered first, as it sets the stage for and explains much of the game itself. Slave Zero was developed by Infogrames North America, or as it was called only a year before in 1998, Accolade. Accolade was a game studio and publisher not often associated with quality. Their poster child, Bubsy the Bobcat, isn't really a mascot who's spoken of with any sort of reverence. And outside of that, the studio was best known for its series of golf games, featuring the legend of the sport, Jack Nicklaus. Come 1999, Accolade would be purchased by and folded into Infogrames, going under the new name Infogrames North America. And it was under this new umbrella that ambitious game producer Stephen Ackridge, best known for his work at Activision seeing the Call of Duty franchise through some of its golden years, would put together a development team to create a brand new, state-of-the-art game engine that would push both the PC market and the upcoming Sega Dreamcast console to new heights. This engine would be flexible, highly advanced, and take advantage of impressive lighting and bump map textures that were still uncommon at the time. It would be called the Ecstasy Engine. The Ecstasy Engine was built from the ground up to be a versatile game engine, focused on creating lengthy, seamless levels and exciting, high-octane fights with large enemy counts, as well as supporting all of the major PC graphics APIs of the time, OpenGL, 3dFX Glide, and most notably, Direct3D, which also enabled the game to take advantage of a brand new, for the time very advanced set of bump map textures. To further the engine's staying power, its level of flexibility also gave it the potential for efficient console ports that performed decently, with Stephen Ackridge looking to the upcoming Sega Dreamcast in particular. With the Ecstasy engine in place, all Ackridge's team needed now was, well, an actual game to debut this engine with. It's here that Ackridge would scout out a talented director to helm the development of a game to show off the Ecstasy engine. He landed on Sean Vess, an already experienced game developer who had served as the lead gameplay designer on the absolutely monumental PC mecha title, MechWarrior 2: 31st Century Combat. With Vess's already clear investment in the mecha genre in general, he felt that a mecha action title would be a perfect fit for this brand new game engine, to really show off the scale it could support. Because what's better to show off a new engine than a giant robot? He would convince Ackridge to greenlight his idea for an action-packed third-person mecha shooter, and this concept would come to be Slave Zero. With Vess at the helm as project director, overseeing the game's core design as well as handling a bulk of the team management, a solid art direction and narrative was needed to breathe more identity into this project. It's here that character designer and environmental artist Ken Capelli would be recruited to handle the game's art direction and mechanical design. Capelli had already shown his chops for creating memorable characters and worlds in the 1996 strategy game, Deadlock: Planetary Conquest. With a director and lead artist picked, a writer would have to be brought on to flesh out the game's central concept. Margaret Stahl, a YA novelist who would cut her teeth writing for the strategy giant Command & Conquer, as well as serving as the lead writer for Dune 2000, would be invited by Sean Vest to serve as the game's writer. Vest and Stahl would brainstorm key sci-fi and mecha media to use as inspirations for the project's dark setting and concepts. They would land on 5 central pillars as the main inspirations: the kaiju films of Toho, Blade Runner, Macross Plus, Bio Booster Guyver, and Evangelion. With Blade Runner's version of Los Angeles, and the neon cylindrical skyscrapers of Macross Plus's Earth City serving as the basis for how Megacity S1 through 9 would appear, and Eva and Guyver serving as a basis for Slave Zero itself, and the central concept for the slaves being biomechanical monstrosities. These ideas would be reflected in Capelli's excellent early design work, focusing on the idea of Slave Zero being a twisted, almost sickly-looking behemoth, consisting of bends and sharply pointed flesh and metal. A true monster of a machine that felt like a mockery of the human form, serving as a parallel to the sacrifice Chan made by giving up their physical form to integrate into and pilot Slave Zero. Unfortunately for Vass, Stahl, Capelli, and the rest of the development team, higher-ups at Infogrames who had more impact on the final say than Stephen Ackrich were not fond of any of Capelli's mechanical designs, or the general concept of biomecha at all, believing that Slave Zero should be closer in appearance to the more practical militaristic machines of the Battletech and MechWarrior series. They also believed that the game's darker tone was unnecessary, and that the game should take on a more traditional, and quote-unquote heroic feeling approach to its style. In a last-ditch effort to try and salvage the brutal biomecha influences the team had, they would show the more strict members of the board VHS recordings of Guyver and Evangelion. Sadly, this was to no avail, and the team would have to come to a compromise, with Capelli in particular being angered that those designs that he put all of that passion and time into would have to be forced in a direction that didn't really fit the initial setting or tone the team aimed for. While expressing his dissatisfaction, and the team's in general, eventually a middle ground was found, and the more biomechanical designs were saved for the enemy units, where Slave Zero would instead take a rounded, ever so slightly friendlier appearance that tried to function as a middle ground between the two ideas. Though looking at early alpha screenshots and comparing them to the final game, it becomes obvious that the biomechanical look of the game was still only used sparsely amongst enemy units. I'm doubly convinced by this since this would be the final time Capelli would work in mechanical design on this scale. As in his own words when discussing the changes to the art direction on his Tumblr blog in 2010, he stated that the changes were a decision I disagreed with and thought was, frankly, a pussy move that minimized the impact of the hero's sacrifice, that he has to become a monster to fight monsters. In the end, the project lead let me down anyway by failing to deliver on the pathos of the story, and the final character, to be shown later, was a result of design by committee. I learned to not hate it, like it a little even, but remain disappointed with it. It was the last time I put my heart into something that someone else owned, and more importantly, that someone else could fall down on. We had the chance to make something bold, memorable, grotesque, and unique. And while it may seem like he's pointing some of the blame here at Sean Vass, which certainly seems unnecessary, his frustration is somewhat understandable, if a bit on the more aggressive side in terms of wording. But with the design and presentation of the game now approved by committee, the team would push forward, going all in on Slave Zero's development. Slave Zero would finally release on Windows and the Sega Dreamcast in November of 1999, with quite the interesting advertising campaign to go along with it. From deals with 3DFX and Nvidia bragging about the power of the Ecstasy engine, to a 90s as hell tie-in with S3's Diamond sound cards, in an ad that claims that you can hear the fear in the NPCs as they piss themselves while Slave Zero towers above them. God, I miss ridiculous game advertising on this level. The game came out to generally mixed reviews, being praised for its gameplay and impressive game engine, and not much else. Slave Zero ended up languishing in relative obscurity, not doing much to rattle the sales charts, and being the only game across its 2 releases to ever use the Ecstasy engine, meaning an entire game engine came and went with Slave Zero's release. And only a year later in 2000, Infogrames North America / Accolade would be absorbed into the main Infogrames brand, essentially shutting down. So, years later, looking at its digital re-release on Steam and GOG from Night Dive Studios, how does the game actually hold up as a mecha shooter? Well, Slave Zero is a blast and a relic of its time, and I mean that in the most positive sense. Slave Zero's core gameplay loop is as simple and satisfying as it gets. Blast through districts of the megacity and destroy everything in your sight. Slave Zero has access to 3 weapon types: ammunition-based, energy-based, and missiles. Slave Zero can carry 1 ammunition-based and 1 energy-based weapon at a time, swapping between the 2 as your primary fire whenever you see fit. Missiles, on the other hand, are always available, serving as your secondary fire, ready to go at any time to deliver some serious splash damage. And there's a pretty wide variety of weapon upgrades to get throughout the game, each managing to pack their own unique punch. From an energy-based shotgun, more assault rifles than you can count, a powerful laser beam that shreds through enemy units, to railguns and giant Uzis, and different types of homing missiles, as well as some multi-spreads. There's a huge variety of ways to absolutely wreck Sov Khan's forces, and the best part about it all is that the game feels great to control. Slave Zero is a fast game, which was true for many shooters of the time, as many of them prioritize speed and movement, as opposed to long-winded battles. While many of the game's levels are very linear, naturally funneling you through the city streets as you head from one arena to the next, the game provides more than enough tools around each battle to make every fight exhilarating. One of the best ways to really get the momentum going in this game is to press the forward key while strafing to the side, as Slave Zero gets a huge speed boost doing this, allowing you to run circles around your enemies and absolutely decimate them, avoiding a majority of attacks and taking full control of the battle. The game's tight shooting and movement does a lot to sell the power of Slave Zero. You also have a pretty strong melee attack which can be used by walking right up in an enemy's face and slapping the hell out of them. Slave Zero can also pick up broken pipes and rods from around the environment and smack enemies with them or use them as a throwing weapon. There's also a stomp attack, which is unfortunately completely useless. In a game this fast and this frantic, an animation this slow just really doesn't fit in. But pretty much everything else in Slave Zero's toolkit is awesome. And with plenty of destructible objects and buildings scattered all over each level, on top of the massive swarms of enemies that flood every screen, there won't be a single moment of this game where something isn't exploding. Gunning down the game's wide variety of enemies never stops being a blast. From massive bipedal railgun-equipped tanks, shield-bearing riot mechs, to VTOLs raining bullets down on you, to Patrick Labors, giant mechanical spiders, and the handful of biomechanical monstrosities that you fight as the game's bosses. Slave Zero knows exactly how to be a fun shooter. But if you're crazy and don't like the third-person camera angle, there's a first-person toggle. Don't use this mode. It was clearly an afterthought and is honestly really disorienting. Otherwise, this game is a blast. And on top of still being very fun to actually play through, Slave Zero's art direction and world design, despite not being exactly what the team might have originally wanted, is still really strong. Megacity S1 through 9 is massive and imposing, with skyscrapers and highways stacked on top of each other like a layer cake, the grimy and polluted looking skybox, and ominous posters of the Sov Khan staring down at you around every corner. The city feels tight, cramped, and oppressive, with almost no breathing room in any district. You can practically smell the urban decay happening in real time through the screen. Residential highways are absolutely packed to the brim of cars. Cars that realistically freak out, drive off the road, and cause pileups when they see Slave Zero's massive figure approaching. You can even grab and toss these cars as projectiles. Near microscopic sprite-based NPCs run for their lives when they see Slave Zero approaching, bursting into puddles of blood when you step on them, or accidentally shoot in their general direction. The sheer size of Slave Zero and the enemy units in the game is highlighted by the oppressive, cramped environments and tiny panicked pedestrians. The variety of each sector you visit throughout your playthrough is also very welcome, from the dingy, poorly maintained, and rusting industrial district, to the advertisement-ridden residential areas, the spacious, dimly lit train yards, to the towering neon-painted temples of the business districts, to the cramped, nasty hallways of the sewers in this universe called The Suck. They call the sewers the suck in this game. The variety of locales helps the game's 6 or so hour runtime never feel too visually redundant. On top of the varied locales, the game's lighting is surprisingly still quite beautiful, with piercing neon lights cutting through the dingy streets, and some of the boss arenas in this game look exceptionally pretty. The game's background details also lend it a nice amount of personality, like these funny little monkey posters strewn about the city. Slave Zero's final design, despite not being to Capelli's liking, is a really distinct design, and frankly still one of the more unique looking mecha I can think of. Slave Zero's almost comically wide, armored shoulders, and its sharp, gangly fingers, give it a design that I can only describe as feeling somewhat Burton-esque. This is also emphasized by the permanent neutral expression its face has. There's something alluring and really interesting about this design. It's unlike any other mecha I've seen, and maybe it does look a little weird and not very cool, but I appreciate originality, and one thing that Slave Zero's design certainly is original. Watching it stomp around screen at incredible speeds is just kinda mesmerizing. He's a funny fella. I mean, look at this loading screen. That is a funny fella loading screen. While the visuals of the game are still pretty strong, the game's audio department could have used some work. The sound design on weapons and explosions is amazing, and hearing Slave Zero's heavy footsteps stomp and reverberate as you power down a highway is something special. And the pulse-pounding music composed by Randy Atkins that blasts through every level matches the adrenaline of the high-octane firefights perfectly. Unfortunately, the game's music and sound effects drown out all of the game's dialogue. I'm talking Deadly Premonition levels of bad audio mixing here.
We have negative contact on dropship 2. Stand by.
The two commanders of the Guardians are constantly talking in your ear, updating you on the status of the mission and what you have to do next. as well as giving Chan some encouraging words as he blasts through the Sovkhan's forces. Or at least I would say that if you could hear them half the time. Even during the game's cutscenes, much of the ambient audio overpowers the characters talking. And this is a real shame in the case of Sovkhan, who's voiced by none other than Noman, Roger Jackson himself. And as he always does, he is chewing the shit out of the scenery in scenes that actually feature him. I just wish it was a lot easier to hear what he says. You can also feel where Margaret Stahl had to make many cuts in the game's script. Slave Zero's story is almost non-existent, and the few sprinkles we do get mostly feel like table scraps left over from the original ideas that had to be cut. It's a shame too, because reading the official strategy guide, you can tell she was excited to work on this project. And that pretty much covers up all of the main elements that make up Slave Zero. It's a short, very fun mecha shooter that I highly recommend going to play right now, and usually I'd end the video here, but there's a few more things that make Slave Zero an interesting time, and really make it a relic of 90s game design. So instead, I want to take the time to explain how easy this game is to snap into. One thing I've intentionally neglected to mention in this video so far is that Slave Zero has a mantling mechanic. Essentially, when you can't quite jump over a wall, if Slave Zero can reach the top of it, he'll grab on, allowing you to pull yourself up or jump up. Simple, right? No, this mantling mechanic allows you to snap any semblance of balance that this game has. By combining strafing and moving forward to get that speed boost I talked about earlier, you're actually allowed to give yourself a higher jump arc. And because Slave Zero can mantle on any object that's a physical platform, by using this boosted jump arc fused with the mantle, you can actually cancel out of your mantle into a second jump. This gives you the chance to gain serious airtime, almost making it so Slave Zero can fly around, giving you a whole extra layer of control on the battlefield. Once you master taking advantage of the boosted jump and mantle to get increased airtime, Slave Zero will literally be ballin' on enemies. Even if this was certainly unintentional, this is the kind of broken mechanic that I love in video games. It opens a whole new layer of player expression, and almost makes you feel like you're playing an arena shooter. I highly recommend learning how to take advantage of this game's mantling system, because you get a whole extra added layer of enjoyment out of the game this way. And I want to thank the world record holder for Slave Zero speedrun, PMC Trilogy, for showing me massive chunks of the game that you can just skip by taking advantage of this mantling system, as well as helping me gather a few factoids for this video. At this point I can knock out Slave Zero in under 2 hours, and it's a lot of fun to play the game this way. Learning how to really take advantage of the mantle and boosted speed makes this already fast-paced action shooter even more of a riot. You can just skip 90% of the firefights in this game if you're fast enough. Zooming through the levels at high speed while raining death from above on Sovkhan's forces is just so awesome. And I really miss when shooters let you get away with stuff like this. Learning to conquer this game's movement system makes an already really fun Twitch shooter into genuinely one of my favorite games of 1999, and really nails why it's so awesome to play as a giant machine of death and destruction. Well, everything I just said is true if you played the game on the PC. Console players got shafted. There's a reason I've neglected to talk about the Dreamcast port so far. It's really bad. First of all, the Dreamcast port's controls are asinine. Before twin-stick controllers were common, shooters had to get really creative with how they would work on a single-stick controller. And Slave Zero, being a PC game designed for mouse and keyboard, really did not pull off this transition well. Even with 6 possible button layouts to choose from, the game is just not a comfortable experience on the Dreamcast. This isn't helped by the complete removal of all of the game's music, a massive reduction of NPCs and cars on the roads, that makes the city in this version feel dead and empty, 90% of the destructible environmental objects being completely removed, and the enemy count being reduced by at least 50% per screen, makes this all around just an inferior version of the game. It doesn't help that it also performs horribly, hitting 60 FPS on a good day, but often during some of the more packed moments, hovering around 15. This port's performance is wildly inconsistent. This is upsetting because you can clearly see the work they put into trying to get this game to work on the Dreamcast. I mean, it was part of the entire sales pitch of the Ecstasy engine to begin with. Absolutely skip this version if you can. The easiest way to play Slave Zero now is to just grab it on Steam or GOG. This digital re-release comes packed in with a 3DFX N-Glide wrapper, meaning that it runs out the gate, though you'll be unable to take advantage of the bump map textures that came with the Direct 3D version of the game. On top of that, the game runs at a much higher resolution in Direct 3D, and just all around looks a lot better on modern systems. If you want to restore Direct 3D and enable higher resolutions, the PC Gaming Wiki has a community patch and a quick guide to help you set it up. But be warned, bumping this game up to higher resolutions for some reason causes the game's crosshair to offset, meaning that your shots won't be accurate at all. This is especially true if you try to go widescreen. To fix this, you can download Pixato's patch, which is also linked on the aforementioned PC Gaming Wiki guide. Slave Zero also has a multiplayer deathmatch mode. While inaccessible on the PC version outside of LAN play, a friend of mine helped me get some multiplayer footage off of the Dreamcast version, and I think I'm just gonna let the gameplay speak for itself. One thing I can say is at least the forced first-person view helps the game run better in multiplayer, I guess. It's a novelty mode at best though, since most of the maps aren't that great. And again, we were playing on the Dreamcast version, so we had to deal with some real clunky controls. But honestly, if you just want to have a laugh with some friends, messing around with the multiplayer isn't necessarily a bad time. Slave Zero still has a pretty dedicated fanbase to this day, and for good reason. As I said, it's just a really fun game to play through, especially when you master those mantling mechanics. And while the team's more ambitious original vision for the mecha elements of the game may have been cut back, we still got a great 90s PC shooter out of it. Currently, the Slave Zero IP belongs to Ziggurat Games, who have teamed up with Devil Engine developer Poppyworks to create a prequel titled Slave Zero X, which instead of a third-person shooter, is opting to be a 2D action game inspired by Strider 2 that's aiming to have an incredibly in-depth combat system, with the lofty goal of aiming to be a 2D Devil May Cry. Visually, the game's looking pretty stunning, harkening back to old Sega Saturn platformers. While this is a vast departure from the original Slave Zero, it still makes me happy to see that this IP is still alive. And look, Slave Zero X has taken the time to put the funny monkeys in the background, so I hope it can stay true in spirit to the original game. I'm interested in seeing how it's going to end up expanding on the world of Slave Zero, because there wasn't too much there to work with. Thankfully, it seems like Poppyworks is being given complete freedom on this game, and I hope they really get to go all out. But frankly, I'm just happy Slave Zero X exists, because it helps keep the memory of the original game alive. A great, underappreciated mecha shooter that I highly recommend going and playing right now.